Many people have problems with art and not with reality.
So why is art different?
It's pretty simple, right?
This is knowledge, this is thinking, this is thought.
Yeah, it does something strange with your head.
Welcome to the Undergang Armchair.
Bring it.
Welcome to the Undergang Armchair. My name is Ando. So, hello everybody. It's nice to be back. Thank you for welcoming me into your head once again. We have a really great show for you today. And yes, sorry, we were not here last week. We're actually working on a series of podcasts for the Copenhagen Photo Festival. I'll tell you more about that when it's all done. I've been trying to get today's guest on the show for a long time, but as these things tend to go, it seems actually to be the perfect time to have him on. It's a little bit of a long one, but that's only because it's that good. I couldn't bear to cut any of it out. Yes, sir, we have Andreas Dalsgaard on today. It's our first film director on the show. He is the illuminated Danish film director of many works, most recently a film I saw, which I really liked, called Life is Sacred. He's worked all over the world, as you'll hear. And in my mind, he has a rare ability for working with people and trying to understand people's thoughts. It's pretty special. So I'm going to leave this short because I'm exhausted, but I just wanted to say thanks to those who came to my show here in Copenhagen. The big news is that I've quit my day job. I'm going to spend more time on this show after the summer vacation. It's on. And there's also some cool stuff in the works. So I'll tell you more about that next time, but there's good stuff on the horizon. So that's it. We'll get straight to it. Enjoy my conversation with Andreas. He's really an amazing dude. And so are the films of his, which I've had the pleasure of seeing. Stick around to the end. He talks about his upcoming project, and it really, truly sounds amazing. So please enjoy my talk with Andreas Dalsgaard. Well, this is by far the earliest I've ever recorded one of these podcasts. What is it, 8:30 in the morning? I know that everybody who has kids is like, oh, fuck you. I don't have kids, though. But it does make me think that you get up early and work hard.
Yeah, but I like to... I didn't used to like to get up early, but since my kids get up early and I have to bring my kids to school, then I'm working from 8 o'clock in the morning. And people who make film, which is the kind of people that I usually work with, they are somewhat dumbfounded when I suggest that we could start work at 8 o'clock in the morning. And then you get on the bike and you go through the city and you realize that that's when most people go to work.
Sure, but we pride ourselves on not being most people, right? I was a little dumbfounded.
But what does that mean, to pride ourselves about not being like most people? That's
that means you don't have an office job.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I used to think that it was an amazing thing to work until 2 o'clock at night and the magic hour from 10 in the evening till 2 o'clock. And I guess it just comes with kids, but my magic hour has become from 8 till 12 in the morning. That's when I'm by far the most productive and the most focused. And to create art, any kind of art, I think, demands a tremendous amount of brain power. So it's good to what do you call it? Wander. Artists have used drugs for as long as time has existed, maybe to exactly do that. But there's a difference between when you wander and then when you create. And when your mind wander, then you can get the inspiration that then goes into the creation. Mm-hmm. But the actual creation demands a tremendous kind of structure and focus.
Yeah. And I think that's where a lot of artists actually have problems, because You're used to the romantic image of an artist as the wild, the drinker, the drugger, the staying out late party person, but you don't get used to the person where you don't think of the picture of the guy who gets up at 6 a.m. A lot of writers, for example, they get up at 5 a.m. and write until noon.
Exactly.
And that's it. That's their only time during the day to write.
But I think there's a lot of confusion regarding this. And I think a lot of the confusion is also related to that art attracts a lot of people who are basically very lazy, trying to find a kind of job that's going to make it possible for them to work very little.
True story.
And any kind of artist who creates anything of value is a very, very hard-working individual.
It's something I see a lot on this show, just from interviewing people again and again and again. People just say, well, I paint 3 times as many pictures as other people and then only show a third of them, or whatever. It's an incredible amount of work. And it's an incredible amount of work that you never really know if it's going to get where you want it to go. You're not sure you're ever going to finish necessarily.
Right. And it's also, you got to love the work. And the kind of recognition you get, no matter how successful you are, is really not why any hardworking, serious artist is doing what they do. Because anyhow, 95% of your time is spent doing the work. So you got to love the work.
I think that's the hard part. I think that's why a lot of people stop, because on the flip side, it's totally true that if you don't have any sort of engagement with the world, most people will have a really hard time continuing to do what they do. You want some sort of validation or some sort of, interfacing with the world in order to keep going. At least I do. I have a really hard time just making stuff for the sake of making it. And I don't know why, if it's ego or if it's just some sort of base desire to engage in dialogue or what it is. But I get extra energy by exhibiting work or by sharing it with people. Even just talking to it, inviting people over and talking about it gives me a lot of energy.
I love talking about my work. I love traveling. I love, to some extent, meeting people. But it does also get more boring with time to meet new people. But it's, it's also something that kind of comes with the territory, because being any kind of artist, you are not, some of your work is, or a big part of your work is meeting people. It's networking. It's building the foundation that can bring your art to other people. Mm-hmm. In my case, as a filmmaker, is also financing what I do. And I spent insane amounts of hours qualifying my work to get financing so that I can actually create. And it's not something that I value. It's not something that I enjoy, but it's just a reality.
That's not as much people, though. That's more just the way it works, the funding system and the way...
No, but it's connected, because the way you fund a film is you go from festival to festival. They have these funding seminars, they call them markets, where you meet with a ton of different people who represent TV stations. They're commissioning editors. So you meet with BBC, you meet with HBO, you meet with whoever could potentially put money into what you do. And that's how you finance it. And part of making my art better is to create a better foundation in terms of network and financing. It's not just financing, it's also the same people who's going to help bring your work to an audience after. And that is, or a big part of that is meeting people. And a big part of that is knowing the right people and having the right kind of network. And let's just be honest about it. It's kind of the same in any art. You want to know the right curator who can put your stuff up at MoMA. Mm-hmm. That's a reality of being a painter, for example. Mm-hmm. And it's everywhere. And it's, I think, also increasingly the case because the world gets more and more complex. We live in a more and more globalized world. So the thing I do is the films I do, they're not just for a Danish audience. They're equally for an audience in other parts of the world. So I have to be able to navigate with a huge field of people.
It sounds intense. I mean, it's totally true what you're saying. And especially the part about it getting more complex makes me think of the fact that there are so many more filmmakers and photographers and so many more channels of promoting and pushing content out into the world. So that makes it, it's like Hollywood in the 50s, maybe. There's less access. There was less access to the people who had the money and the control over networks and channels. And so it was, once you were in, it was easier to get attention. But now there's so much access and there's so many people, whether it's just someone on Twitter trying to get the attention of a famous curator or, filmmaker or whatever.
Well, being a documentary filmmaker, more and more seems to me to be a little bit like building up a name for a band. You travel extensively, give concerts everywhere, because that's the way that you build up your band. Yeah. And the part of making a film is only one part of bringing my work to an audience. I used to think that if I made a great film, then the rest would happen on its own. And it's just not the case. Mm-hmm. Ideally, whenever I make a film, I should travel for 2 years. Wow. And just push it at wherever festival it gets into. I should go there because every festival is also a gateway to other festivals, new kinds of audiences. And I mean, for me, it's practically impossible. I have 2 kids. I live a boring middle class life in Copenhagen, and I actually value spending time with my kids and getting up in the morning at 8 and taking them to school and doing the work. That's, in the end of the day, that's where the true love is.
Well, don't you think at a certain point, if you're lucky, you can get to a point where that system sustains itself. You get enough of a name that you don't have to be out there shaking hands, but you really have to reach the top 5%.
Well, I don't think it's the top 5%. It's maybe the top 5 people. Mm-hmm. And what gets you there? It's I'm basically at a place right now where I've just decided not to care, because I'm in and I'm able not to care. I'm luckily able to finance the films that I want to make, and I have a full slate of work in front of me. So I've just decided, it's actually a decision I've made this year. It's like I don't even want to be stressed about it, because I cannot play that game of traveling around the world. I do not want to play it. And I have a ton of respect for people who do it. But in the end of the day, it's about what makes me happy. It makes me happy to do the work. And all the other stuff is just noise.
You made it then.
I didn't
if you made that decision.
Whatever. What does that mean? What does that really mean?
Well, it's chasing a goal, right? Whatever that goal may be, which is also a changing thing.
Well, for me, the rate of success is one thing and one thing only. It's whether I'm able to get up in the morning and do the work and create and make the kind of films that I would like to make, and the kind of creative work that fulfills me. At whatever level of success when it comes out, that is beyond my control. But if I can have that kind of life, then I'm basically where I need to be, and the rest is just leave it up to destiny to to decide that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm quite envious of a writer. I'm quite envious of painters, because to some extent they can get up and do the work regardless of anything around them. It's not entirely true. We still need to put bread on the table, but you know, you're working much more on your own. Where film, for me to make a film, I need at least $1 million for one documentary.
Yeah.
So
it's a lot more money than oil paints and canvases.
Exactly. So,
but I mean, obviously you've worked up to this position you're in now through many years, and you started out as an anthropologist, right? Or you studied anthropology?
I studied anthropology. I never intended to become an anthropologist.
Did you intend to be a filmmaker?
Yeah. I wanted to be a filmmaker, and I did not want to make coffee for other filmmakers. Mm-hmm. So instead of working my way up in production houses, which kind of seemed like the most obvious way, I enrolled in university. And we live in a country where when you're a student, you actually get money from the state because you study. So I was working on a film project, and I needed to edit it for like 8 months. And to do that, I kind of needed to survive. So I decided, okay, I'll enroll in university and I'll do the classes while I get the student support so I can make the film.
Genius.
And I looked through the list of courses over the summer. I was like, anthropology, that sounds interesting. And I enrolled and made the film, but I actually also fell in love with anthropology. And I ended up studying a bit more than 3 years, so I never got a master. I got a bachelor's degree. But it really brought me to become also the kind of filmmaker that I am today. Well,
you went on to do visual anthropology specifically, which is very much related.
Yeah.
Or can be.
I mean, it was more the way that as I was studying anthropology, the Twin Towers fell down. I just started studying that year, and as the towers went down, the world decided to invade Afghanistan. And my department of anthropology is the department in the entire world which has studied Afghan culture most intensely.
Is that here in Copenhagen?
That's in Aarhus, the second biggest city in Denmark. And it's a huge collection of cultural artifacts from Afghanistan. There's a huge knowledge that's been built up in that department. And a lot of people who had studied and worked at that department were then sent to Afghanistan to work for NGOs and the UN because they had that expert knowledge. So I, together with some other anthropologists, young students, thought there's this thing happening in this country and we have this amazing access. Let's go there. And they wanted to do field work. I wanted to do a film because that's basically what I was interested in making. And so that brought me to Afghanistan about a year after the invasion, or in the summer that followed. And what I wanted to do was to find a kind of story that could be a counter-narrative to everything that we were seeing at the media at the time, which was a bombed-out Kabul. It was women in burqas and it was mullahs with long beards, and basically the cliche of and you know the scary image of this place, which confirms any kind of feeling inside people that Afghans are very, very far away from us as people. And I was fed up with that kind of media narrative. So I wanted to see what other narratives were there. And what's interesting, and that happens in any kind of conflict zone, is that the photographer, the journalist photographer who goes there, will point the camera in the direction of the most bombed out building. So the kind of images you see will always be the most dramatic images of a much more complex reality. And as I arrived in Kabul, it was this very, very interesting, vibrant city where there were areas that were completely bombed out, for sure. But there were also areas where you had mansions from the 70s, modernist mansions that used to be inhabited by the Taliban, and now foreign NGOs were taking them over. And I went to a pool party with hot girls from around the world who were working as NGOs in Kabul. I went to a pool party and in the middle of Kabul. And I walked down the street and there were Bollywood posters everywhere. Nobody were just making images of this reality.
Right.
And so I thought that was interesting, and this meeting between such opposites. Mm-hmm. So another thing that I saw when I was walking was huge posters, beautifully hand-painted posters, 2 by 3 meters, of either Arnold Schwarzenegger in trunks or Ronnie Coleman, who was at that time the world champion of bodybuilding. Everywhere around the town, you saw these weird posters, and there would be a burqa walking underneath this poster. And it was like, that image was just wild. So I went in. I realized that bodybuilding had been popular for years, was exploding at the time in popularity, and was more or less the most popular sport in the country.
Really? Huh.
And for me, it was like, wow, that's a story that I never heard. That is completely contrary to anything we expect to see.
But did you go there with no idea what you were going to do or find? You just went there with an open heart and mind?
Yeah.
And it was your first time there?
Yeah. And then I started traveling there, came back a few times, followed a group of bodybuilders, mm-hmm. and made my first film, Afghan Muscles, mm-hmm. which also became like my entry into the filmmaking world.
So who helped you into that process? You had the dream of becoming a filmmaker. You were studying anthropology, but it sounds like you had no practical knowledge of making a film, how to edit, how to shoot, whatever other thousands of things go into producing a film when you make it yourself.
Totally. I had absolutely no experience. Well, I had some. I had made some work before. I had been to what's called the European Film College, which is like a 1-year program. So I'd done some work, but not any work that I would today call show to anybody. Mm-hmm. Basically,
yep.
No way.
We all have that.
But yeah, but that kind of amateur's energy was, I think, the big quality, and it comes through in the film. I basically agree with Werner Herzog when he says that the worst thing people can do if they want to be a filmmaker is to go to film school. The biggest thing I regret is to have gone to film school.
The same argument could be made about art school too.
And I came out with Afghan Muscles the same year that I started a 4-year film school, the National Danish Film School. So I was accepted as a director there. Based
off of Afghan Muscles or what?
And some other work. I'd made a little short film fiction to apply for the school. But I learned to make film doing Afghan Muscles. What I learned in film school was how other people thought I should make films, mm-hmm. or thought films should be made. And I think it's hugely important to understand art history, film history. All of that is hugely important. But I think that the kind of way we approach schools when it comes to something like filmmaking is just wrong. Even today, I don't learn how to make films I don't get inspired to make my films by looking at other people's films. I get inspired by going out into life. I get inspired by looking at art, paintings, photography, literature, so many different things, but not other films. Because what could I learn by looking at other people's films? It would be to make films that are replicas of theirs.
And there's no technical angles or anything which you can glean by watching a good film?
Well, let me qualify my argument. But it's, of course, I look at other films. And in the process of making a film, yes, I do look at how did this film deal with this kind of challenge. Mm-hmm. So you have a certain scene and you want to solve it in a creative way. You look at how other people did it and then you find your way. Sure, of course, you steal and you rob. But to find the heart of a film, to find the kind of core that makes a film special, that runs through a film, is not something you find by looking at other films.
I agree.
So technically, sure.
And that you can't teach either.
Yeah.
But did you finish school then?
Yeah, I finished school. And,
did you just hate it for 4 years or what?
No, I liked it and people were nice and...
people were nice sounds like the worst insult there could be.
It is.
But you did it.
It's a question of... For me, I was 29 when I got out of film school, which means that I spent 24 years of my life in school. Was that worth it? What did I get in those 4 years that I could not have gotten by traveling the world, making new films?
You got the rubber stamp that says, I'm officially graduated.
But that's not even worth anything in filmmaking.
Really? Nothing?
No.
Oh, you make me feel so much better. I'm an art school dropout.
But it's the rubber stamp that you talk about is only something that matters to people who did not get into a school, because they imagine that the kind of struggles they have are connected with the rubber stamp that they're missing.
True story. But you got to admit, Denmark's very educationally oriented. It's all about that track, going through the track and then popping out the other end, and then you can do whatever you want, basically. But
as a filmmaker, you are the work that you've done. Yes, you can go to film school, you can make a good piece of work, but and that can help you make a new work. But to imagine that film school is more than that is just false. You have a ton of filmmakers in Denmark who never went to film school. And I think oftentimes the most interesting filmmakers are the ones who didn't go to film school. Mm-hmm. Why? Because they come in with a different kind of experience. They bring something new.
They may be more motivated too.
And they might be more motivated. And I mean, this is especially the case in documentary filmmaking. People come from all walks of life and become documentary filmmakers. And it's something you can actually do, because you can take a camera, you can go out, you can find a fantastic story, you can edit it. And once you've made that film, and maybe along the way you'll need some people's help to bring it to the level where it can be. And once you have that piece of work, that's your entry point to make another one. You can take around the world. You are a full-fledged filmmaker just by doing that.
So what were you after Afghan Muscles?
I was a full-fledged filmmaker. I should have gone out and made another film. I do treasure and value certain things about my time in film school. So I don't want to sound ungrateful.
You got your prison buddies. You got your.
But I am a little bit ungrateful, because I don't think that those 4 years were well spent.
So you did Afghan muscles, then you went to school, and then that was the moment where it was like, okay, now what? I imagine, you graduate, or is it more like, fuck, I got to get going now?
When Afghan muscles came out, it was between my first and second year in film school. It traveled many places. It won the American Film Institute Grand Prix. Did really well. That energy could have brought me into a new film, and I think that kind of tide would have taken me in a positive way into a more natural way of becoming a filmmaker, rather than going to film school and learning how to be a filmmaker. You learn through your work. Doing the work is what makes you a filmmaker. And I mean, film school went well. I did my graduation film. It actually won as the best graduation film in the world among 99 other film schools competing.
Which film was that?
It's called Copenhagen.
Okay.
So it's a 30-minute short film. So, I mean, it did really well. But I still came out of film school confused in many ways.
Do you think that's just because you felt like you were displaced? I mean, you should have been making a movie instead of going to school, and that felt unnatural? Or what were you confused about?
I thought I would go to film school and figure out who I was as an artist. And it didn't help me to achieve that. Whether I just had a bad experience in film school, others have probably experienced the opposite. But this was my experience. And it meant that I came out of film school more confused than when I got in. And I think that's basically the end of that. I also learned a ton of stuff, so that's how it is.
But what did you do then when you graduated? Did you decide, I got to make a movie, I got to figure this out, or were you discouraged, or what happened immediately afterwards?
In the end of film school, I was offered to do a film in Colombia. It was at that time fully financed. So I said yes, because it was an interesting topic.
Was that through a network thing? Or was that an offer that came out of the blue, or what?
It was network,
okay.
I guess. And, well, I was basically developing another project in China, because I thought that when I got out of film school, I wanted to have like a film ready. And then as I was developing that with a production company, that production company was making the other one, and they needed a director on it. And they asked me. So the last 2 months of film school, I kind of dropped out, and I went to Colombia and I shot the film. And it came out 6 months later.
Wow, that's fast. Was that Bogota?
That was Bogota, yeah. And that kind of threw me into documentary filmmaking again after studying fiction for 4 years.
Oh, you thought maybe you were going to make fiction movies.
Well, I thought I wanted to do both, and I still do.
When you first got interested in film, was it documentary or fiction or both, or you didn't know? Or
when I first got into film, I think like any other, I thought I should make fiction.
Okay.
Because that was the picture of a film director that I had.
You were going to be Francis Ford Coppola or something? Something
like that. and then by accident, I started doing documentary. Fell in love with that.
It's very anthropology based. I mean, that would be a natural step from anthropology.
But there's never been a big game plan, so to speak. I really treasure filmmakers who move between fiction and documentary. Mm-hmm. I think the idea that these things are even separated is false. And I think that these filmmakers who do both become better at both. So that's how I look at it. And my heroes are generally people like that. And I'm now developing 2 fiction projects. The thing that's been for me with fiction happening since I 6 years ago got out of film school was that I've been so busy making documentaries that and raising a family that to find that extra time to develop a fiction film has been difficult to find. So right now I'm trying to really allocate the time for that.
So you went to Colombia, you made Bogota.
Right.
And I can only assume that at some point there you met Antanas Mokus or somebody connected to Antanas Mokus or...
Yeah, the film was part of a series about cities, mega cities, the challenges they face, and possible solutions. So the reason I was asked to do Bogota was because it had won big prizes for being like a model for change. And it was widely known that there were 2 mayors who had played a significant role in that. Antanas Mokus being one, and the other Enrique Peñalosa. So the film was supposed to be about Antanas Mokus and his work as mayor. But right before I went, I took part in a masterclass in Copenhagen with the other mayor, Enrique Peñalosa, who by accident was visiting Copenhagen then. And I became very fascinated with his work in infrastructure and how he built bikeways and sidewalks and basically made a more democratic city by changing the infrastructure. And first of all, I thought that was another important part of the story that should be told if we were to tell the story about how Bogota became a model city. And secondly, I just, as part of my research, when I came to Bogota then, I went with my producer around to meet people, met Antanas Mokus, and I met the other mayor, Enrique Peñalosa. And as we walked into his office, my producer said, "So by the way, we're making this film about Antanas Mokus and about how he changed Bogota." And Enrique Peñalosa got out of his chair and started on a rant about how it was not Antanas Mokus, it was him who had made the difference. And that rant went on for at least 2.5 hours, non-stop. Shit. And I mean, he's a very intense guy. And me sitting there, I, number one, already thought that he was an important part of the story. And number two, I thought, great, I have my film. Because these 2 guys clearly don't like each other. They're clearly somewhat like-minded in terms of values, in terms of what they've actually given to the city, just in different ways. And at the same time, they just cannot stand each other.
Right, they're very ambitious and 2 ambitious people often.
Right. So it became this story about how these 2 were competing and in the end of the day, changing the city together, but weren't able to give each other the credit for it.
All right. But the movie didn't end up turning out to be about that, really, unless we're all of a sudden talking about human scale.
No, Bogota Change is about these 2 mayors and what they did and how they complemented each other.
Oh, right, of course. I'm getting confused because then you followed up and made the next movie about Antanas.
Right. What came out of that film was that I became very fascinated with the philosophy of how to do politics that Antanas Mokus represent. And his way of thinking, his personality. And I really felt like that deserved a bigger story. And by accident, as we were wrapping up this film, Bogota Change, he became a presidential candidate and became a head of like this wave of change. You could call it the political spring in Colombia. It was like revolutionary times, and Antanas Mokus was the figurehead, the symbol, and the philosopher behind it. So I took my camera and I went there and I decided to follow up and use the opportunity to make a story that would be more about him and less about urban change in Bogota, which the first film had as its main topic.
So basically, you were lucky enough to stumble on an incredible moment in the political history of a country, in the personal journey of a man, et cetera, et cetera.
Completely. And it was something that when we shot Bogota Change, the first film, nobody thought that he would be relevant in politics in at least the short term. And he was widely considered to be someone sort of on the fringes.
Right, the crackpot, left.
I mean, this kind of weird-looking intellectual who says really important stuff that people listen to, but who's not expected to play an important part in politics.
He has such an incredible way of talking.
Yeah.
I mean, from watching your movie, just the way he can formulate ideas and thoughts was super impressive. You know, he kept saying things where I was like, oh, that's what I think, but he just said it 100 times better. You know, he's so good at that sort of discourse. And I'll never forget, there's a scene in the movie where a journalist asks some sort of snotty question and he shuts him down in the most non-violent yet forceful, or at least solid way. It's amazing just watching the way he can deal with that sort of thing.
Right.
Which may be also why he did end up having some success, or at least become a player.
There's no other politician like him in the world, in my view. Mm-hmm. And the way that he uses words and symbols, or the way that he challenges the way we use words and the kind of symbols that we have with new words and symbols that travel into the vocabulary and become something that shape reality, is extraordinary. And it's like an artist, really. I mean, he's like an artist in politics in the way that he does that. You can really see how artist runs through his spine. His mother is a very, very skilled sculptor. Mm-hmm. So he grew up in a world of art, and that's something that's informed his way of approaching politics in connection with his background as a philosopher. Mm-hmm. And just to give an example, there is phrases from that election that we see in the beginning of Life is Sacred, my second film about him, such as no todo vale, not everything is allowed, that today is widely spoken in Colombia and used whenever someone goes beyond the ethical boundaries of how we're supposed to act. Mm. Then other people will say, no todo vale.
It's not valid.
Yeah. And everything is not allowed. Mm. Come on, everything is not allowed. But this is a country where generally not everything, but too many things are allowed. And you see it in politics. You see it in the way that corruption is rampant. So that's one thing. Another thing is the slogan, I came because I wanted, not because you paid me. It was chanted all over Colombia. And that has also traveled into the way that people talk, the way politicians talk. In a country where politics is usually a question of who pays who. Mm-hmm. So you vote vote for whoever gives you a bit of money. And there's so many things where, he manages to take something that could be very complex and just synthesize it in a little phrase and a word that everybody understands.
And it's so relevant. It's not dumbed down. It's just presented super streamlined, accessible, intelligent.
Yeah. And could be accused of being a populist, doing that. But then what is a populist? Isn't it exactly the task of a politician to bring people together around ideas that can help us build our societies.
Right. That's the difference between a populist, I'd say. I'd say Trump is a populist because he brings people together around ideas which go nowhere, which are just rhetoric. You know, whatever political meaning you might have, there seems to be no substance to what he says. It's just populist rhetoric in order to incite certain feelings. Whereas Mokus was much more about rhetoric which got to the heart of the matter.
Yeah.
You know, and had some sort of platform to stand on.
And Colombians recognize that. They know that. So whenever there is something said by Antanas, or a simple or a foolish act, he uses humor a lot, Colombians know that the buffoonery is built on a very solid foundation and a very clear analysis of what are the essential problems in Colombia, how do we deal with them, and his analysis of Colombian society is primarily that illegality penetrates every part of society, and to fight that illegality cannot just be the task of the police. It has to be the task of, or it has to be about changing the culture, because it's the culture that allows it as well. And what that basically means is, if you look at, he has sort of a divided what controls our behavior into three systems. There's the law, which is enacted by the police and so on, the military. And then there is the social, which is, I will not steal because you will not like me if I steal. There's the ethical. I will not steal because I will not like myself. And we're to a great extent controlled by the social and by the ethical. And if you can change that, if you can start tweaking those elements as well, then you can achieve a lot. And that's everything that he's ever done has been trying to find a way to do politics that plays on all three parameters rather than just changing the law and then thinking that things will be fine.
And that changes. I mean, you never hear that in politics, you know, or if you do, it's empty. And I think that's what was so refreshing about it. You know, I saw the opening of that movie and I thought it was really powerful. And the audience did too, you know, just being in that room, watching the way people reacted. He was obviously there. The young woman who's in the movie, I forget her name. Catherine was there, and she was, you know, kind of emotionally reliving her experience through the movie. It was real. I was sitting right in front of her, or right behind her, and she was, you know, having a really hard time watching the movie because she was reliving it. And it just made for such an intense experience being present during that showing. It was super interesting and very touching.
Yeah, it was a special night. And in the case of Antanas, he's sick with Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
No, sorry.
No, it's the one. What's it called?
Parkinson's.
Parkinson's. Yeah.
I always mistake the two. Parkinson's. So in the film, you also see the progressive development that disease has. And in a way, and I mean, he said that to me, this is his legacy, or part of his legacy. And that night, showing the film to him, he'd seen it once before, but for the first time, having him seeing it with an audience and see his work, which he has great doubts about the relevance of. To see that being shared with other people in a way where complete strangers who have no knowledge of Colombia get him.
Right, here we are in Denmark watching a movie about Colombian politics.
Yeah. And suddenly it's a movie that I think is the special thing about that movie, is what we normally see from Colombia is drugs and violence. Here's something that is just absolutely unique and can inspire people everywhere. And it is, and it has. And that's kind of magic.
Were you happy with the movie?
The movie was a huge struggle to make. It was very difficult to get it done. was very difficult to finance it. And it meant that we spent 5 years doing it, which was, in the end, a huge gift to the film, that we couldn't finish it because political events in Colombia kind of kept evolving, and I kept following, and we implemented it into the film. So in the end, we ended up having this sort of 5-year portrait of his time in Colombian politics. And he played a very decisive role in an election, for example, where the peace process was at stake. And he came in and kind of helped save the peace process, which now, I think this year, will bring a peace negotiation. The FARC and the government will sign a peace deal, which will solve a conflict that's been ongoing since 1958.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's was kind of a life and accidents and coincidences all played a part in a film that at times was very, very difficult to make, but at the end it made for the better film. And it's, I think, among the 2 films that I've made that I have the greatest affection for. So I am very proud of that film.
Where does the human scale fit in? We kind of skipped over that, and it seems like, so that must have come out while you were working or shooting on Life is Sacred?
Totally. I shot the first parts of Life is Sacred in 2009 and 10, and right after that, I was asked if I wanted to do a film about the Gale office, an architectural office in Copenhagen, which is the most influential urban planning office in the world, I'd say.
So you were again invited to do this film?
I was asked, or there was like an open call where several filmmakers were asked to give their take on the film. Mm-hmm. And it was a foundation in Denmark that wanted the film made about the work. And then I was asked to do the film and spent like 9 months, I think, working on it. So we kind of put the other project on hold while I did that film. And
that's relatively fast again, 9 months.
Yeah, but it was part of the plan was that it had to be ready for the Venice Biennale. So that was in late August. So we started work in like December, I think.
Jesus Christ.
And the film takes place in, I think, 7 or 8 different places around the world. Yeah. China, Bangladesh,
it's a lot US. Of flying around.
So there's a lot of traveling involved. And it's also a film that I really, really love. And I feel very proud of it. It was, and still is, like, very, very successful. And has really made a huge impact in certain places. Just a few months ago, I was called up from Guatemala City, where the wealthiest family in Guatemala saw this film and decided that they were going to put multi-million dollars into remaking Guatemala City according to these principles that the film lays out. And it's not the only place that this has happened. So to see a film have that kind of impact is extraordinary.
That is not nothing.
And the film has, been in cinemas in 20 plus countries, and for a documentary has done extremely well. But ironically, it's a film that was actually made rather fast.
Yeah.
Although not cheaply.
Right. Money helps things move along, of course. But then, then you made Life is Sacred, which is a very, very different film. Although it does seem to me, with my knowledge of your work, that it is very much about people. And in a way, it's very much about, it's kind of your idea is very your general work is very hopeful about humans and about the future and about progress, and you don't shy away from all the difficulties we face. But it seems to me like the message at the end is positive, is uplifting. Do you ever think about your work in the larger picture, in the as an oeuvre, to name a terrible word?
Yeah, very much so. I'm genuinely interested in people, not just one-to-one, but how societies are constructed and how we as people play a part in that. I think that that's a common thread that runs through everything that I've done. And you can say that that's, in a way, a sort of anthropological kind of eye that's present everywhere. At the same time, I'm a strong believer that the way a film is told is, or should be, shaped by what the story is. And what I mean by that is that whenever I make a film, I try to clean out the plate and say, okay, I have this kind of story in front of me. What's the right kind of a language to tell this story? And it's in a way saying that the story or the people and what I find interesting there is more important than my artistic ego coming in and saying, this is my language, that's how I make a film. I really love the process of engaging with a certain story, seeing it evolve in front of me, and through that finding the right kind of language for that type of story. And I'm also a strong believer in that process can bring about a new kind of language. And every film that I've made is also sort of investigating new languages in film. Mm-hmm. So you'll see that my stories are actually quite different from each other in style. And that comes from the fact that the process of making it is really what defines the style. And what's interests me is the process of bringing something to fruition.
Well, that sounds like it'd be the hard part. You know, because again, anybody can go out theoretically and shoot, let's just say 800 hours of footage. The hard part is making that into a movie.
Right. It's terribly hard.
Do you have any advice for anybody who's interested in making a documentary? Or a movie, I guess I should say. Don't go to film school.
I always, I think, approach topics that are not very film-friendly. I think I like that challenge. And I like to put a film language onto something that may not have had one before. So there's a lot of topics that I shy away from because I find them in a way too easy.
Like what?
Let's say you can make a film about a boxing match. It's a very natural story. There are winners, there are losers, there are things at stake. And it's very filmic. What's not typically filmic is things that happen inside people's head, things that are idea-based, and those are the things that interest me. So then the challenge is to find, let's say in the case of Colombia and Tanas Mocos, it's ideas, it's thoughts, it's philosophy. How can I find a film language where we embody that so that you and me can experience it? In the case of The Human Scale, it's theories, ideas about how we make our cities, and in a way through that, how have we constructed the societies we live in today? That's what the film is about. how can I, as a filmmaker, embody that into a visual, emotional experience? That's the task, and it demands a huge amount of listening, because I usually, and anybody will usually come in with a preset set of ideas about how to do something. Mm-hmm. And it's only when that's challenged by, let's say, the expert knowledge of someone who truly knows something about how we make cities. And when, as a filmmaker, I have the humbleness to actually listen to that and then challenge my artistic ideas in that meeting, it doesn't mean that I'm just a mouthpiece for that person. It means that how can I, in a deep way, understand what's in that person's mind, what that person understands when he or she sees the world. Because, let's say in the case again of an urban planner architect who spent years and years dealing with this topic, they have everything in their head. So I have to really cut to the core of why that's important, why that matters to them. And then I have to find a visual language and like a language in words and music and sound that can make this something that you and me can experience in a powerful way. That process, whether it's a writer, I've made a film about, or not really a writer, but a guy who wants to be a writer and tries to write a book. I've made a film about that. I've made a film about urban planning. I've made a film about political philosophy. And it's always the same kind of process, you could say, that I go through. The result can look very different, but I think you also find that there's like an emotional core that is kind of present everywhere, or set of values that travels through these things. And that's how I work.
You may have just described how to make a documentary film the best way I've ever heard it. That was the most kind of clearly and to the point idea about how to work with ideas and then translate them. Do you want to talk about future projects? What's coming up, or is that in the bag?
Sure.
Can you kind of quickly tell us about what's coming up, what you're working on now?
I've been for the last bit more than a year working on a film with a group of Syrians, primarily a woman, former radio host from Damascus, who have filmed and lived through the last 5 years of conflict, starting out with revolution, political change, hope for a more fair society, and then things have escalated into the tragedy that we see today. Mm-hmm. There is a massive amount of footage. You mentioned like sitting with 800 hours, and that's basically the case here. It's less than 800, but maybe 300 or 400 hours of randomly filmed footage, which has an emotional power to it because it's real, and it's not filmed with a certain intention. She was just there, and she was present as a human being and engages with people, and she has a very nice way of getting people to talk. So you really meet a lot of people in this film who share with you certain moments of the war. Mm-hmm. It's a very unique, powerful material, and a very powerful, tragic story. They start out being 6 friends in Damascus. Of those 6 friends, 3 are dead today. 1 was in prison 2 years, escaped recently. And the remaining 2 are today refugees living outside Syria. So in the film, we see their journey from the early days of kind of naive hope and not just hope for political change, but it's also a revolution on a personal level, experiencing freedom. One of them froze off her hijab for the first time. They experience freedom in a lot of different ways because that's the time they live in, and we see that happening. And then things just escalates into darkness. And so I've been sitting with that for about a year. First writing it based on these 300 hours, and I'm making it in collaboration with Obi, the main character, and then building up the story based on these 300 hours of footage in a way where it becomes a piece of art that makes me travel into her mind in a way, taking the journey that she's taken through 5 years that's brought her into a very, very difficult place. She's today traumatized by war and by the loss of these people, and it's an ongoing thing. It's part of the making this film has been dealing with all the trauma that she's in. And a few months ago, I was sitting with her, and it was between Christmas and New Year's, and her hometown, which we see in the film, was at that time being emptied out after 3 years under siege, 6 months blocked off for any kind of food. People were dying of hunger. It was as bad as the ghetto in Warsaw in the Second World War. And the weird thing is that internet was working. I could sit together with her and Skype stream live images of friends and family of hers that are dying of hunger at this very moment. And so making this film has been challenging on so many levels personally, building her up as a human being to give her the strength to make this film together with me. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, understanding her mind enough so that I can make the story in a way so that the audience is brought to the point that she is at. Because the true power of this film, I think, is that at the end of the film we see people in boats crossing the Mediterranean. Who are these people? It's a crisis that we're dealing with today in Europe, globally, and we need to understand why these people are in these boats.
Right, they didn't just come out of nowhere.
Yeah, and what brought that situation in Syria, because it's not something that we can not understand. It's something that we can truly understand if we go in, and I think this film can achieve some of that.
Sounds like a nearly impossible task. I mean, I know you're the man for the job, but it sounds so hard.
It's extremely challenging and emotionally exhausting.
Yeah.
Kind of emotional exhaustion that I'm going through is little compared to what she's been going through. But,
right. Any feelings you have of it being hard is also followed by guilty feelings of being like, oh, my life is so easy.
Kind of. But again, it's that process of listening, which is applied here. And through that, making a journey that brings the film to into something that others can understand and be touched by. And it's funny because the word director in Danish is instructor. And I think a lot of Danish directors think that they should be instructors. And it's a huge misunderstanding. If you instruct someone, you tell them what to do. You never tell an actor what to do. You never tell a human being what to do. Or at least if you do, don't expect them to be generous with themselves. Directing is a much more beautiful word, because basically as a director, your task is to take all the energies that are in front of you. It's both an editor and it's a producer and it's a main character, anything, and make sure that that streams into one flow, that more and more becomes this crystal clear expression we call a film. The French word is réalisateur. You realize something. And that's the task that you have as a filmmaker. Your ego is not important. And if I have to bend down and bend over and do whatever I need to do in order to make all these streams flow into one river, then that's what I have to do. It's the task, because I'm not important.
Perfect. It's a perfect place to leave it. I could go on forever. I could go on for another hour, but you've been very generous with your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for coming. I appreciate it very much. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Undergang Armchair. The intro and outro music was kindly provided by Johnny Ripper, and today's interstitial music was provided by RC. You can find links to their music and tons of other conversations with great people on our production house of a website, undergang.net. If you like this show, we would appreciate it if you'd take the time to leave a review on iTunes. It helps other people find us. The show is produced in part with the kind support of the Danish Arts Council. Thanks for joining us.